How does a country, you know, historically known for potato farming and mass immigration, suddenly wake up one day with an economy so explosive that international economists literally thought their tracking software was glitching?
Right. I mean, it's the kind of thing that just doesn't happen.
Exactly. So imagine you're an economic planner, right?
Yeah.
You're looking at a nation on the absolute periphery of global influence.
A place that's heavily reliant on agriculture, really just struggling to find a solid foothold.
Yeah, and now imagine that within just a few decades, that exact same nation completely rewrites its economic DNA. It bypasses the industrial age entirely, leapfrogs the middle-income trap, and becomes one of the wealthiest high-tech and service hubs on the planet.
It's an incredible scenario to picture.
It really is. So today we're doing a deep dive into an amazing 15-slide presentation that uses the World Bank's long-cycle macroeconomic data to investigate this.
We're looking at the greatest economic magic trick of the 21st century, really the systemic transformation of Ireland.
Yeah, and we're looking at a fascinating source document today. To give you, the listener, a visual, the cover slide of this quantitative study is striking.
It really sets the tone, doesn't it?
It does. It has a stark white background, a very minimalist academic style. There's a dark gray vertical line on the left, and on the right there's this abstract map of Ireland.
But it's not a normal map, right?
No, it's completely made out of scatter plot dots, and there are no bright, flashy colors. Just this really sharp contrast of navy blue and deep gray. It basically says, hey, we are looking at objective facts today.
Which is exactly what we need to do, because this transformation challenges almost everything we thought we knew about traditional economic development.
How so?
Well, usually, escaping poverty is a brutal, centuries-long slog. You build textile mills, then you build steel plants.
Right, the classic industrialization model.
Exactly. And then maybe, generations later, you start designing software. It's a ladder.
But they didn't climb the ladder.
Right. No, the data we are looking at today proves that, under the exact right conditions, a nation can essentially skip the middle rungs of that ladder.
That's fascinating.
But, what I find most compelling about this deep dive isn't the flashy headline numbers, it's the mechanics.
But how and the why?
Exactly. How do you engineer a society to attract global capital? And what are the hidden structural costs of completely tethering your national survival to the whims of the globalized market?
And we are definitely going to get into all of those hidden costs. Because the data paints a picture that is far more complicated and far more fascinating than the standard marketing brochure you might see.
Oh, absolutely. It's not all sunshine and rainbows.
Right. We're stripping away the mythology today. No folklore, just the rigorous, objective reality of the numbers.
I love that approach.
So let's start with a headline that basically broke the brains of financial journalists everywhere. We need to look at slide 2.
Ah, the GDP slide.
Yeah, we need to talk about the gross domestic product, the GDP, because the trajectory here is just absurd.
It really looks like a typo on the chart.
It does. We are looking at a line chart of a historical timeline where per capita GDP starts at under $1,000 US.
Very standard for a peripheral, agrarian-heavy economy at the time.
Right. But then fast forward to recent years, and it breaks the $100,000 barrier. It peaks at over $106,000 per person.
Which is just a staggering number to try and comprehend.
To put that in perspective for you listening, that places this traditionally agrarian economy in the absolute stratosphere of global wealth.
They're rubbing shoulders with banking fortresses like Switzerland and Luxembourg.
Exactly. But the devil is always in the details.
Very much so, because if you look closely at that line chart, the curve doesn't just go up smoothly.
Right. There's a specific visual call-out on the slide. They drew a gray dashed circle around the year 2015.
Yes, and there's a dark blue arrow pointing upward, labeled exponential leap.
Because right there, the data shows an exponential violent leap. In a single 12-month period, the GDP of the entire nation shot up by 26%.
Which, I have to point out, is physically impossible in a traditional economy.
Exactly. I mean, a nation's people don't suddenly wake up on January 1st and work 26% harder.
Right, or build 26% more houses out of nowhere.
Or bake 26% more bread. So walk us through the actual plumbing of this. There's a little text box on the slide that mentions multinational profit shifting.
Yes.
Financial circles sarcastically dub this Leprechaun Economics. What is the actual mechanism that causes a developed nation's GDP to artificially explode overnight?
So to understand the mechanism, we really have to look at what GDP actually measures, and more importantly, what it completely fails to measure in the 21st century.
Okay, let's unpack that.
Gross domestic product was a metric designed in the industrial era to count physical things. Cars rolling off assembly lines, tons of coal mined, haircuts given within a country's physical
Still
borders.
tangible stuff.
Right. But the modern economy is increasingly weightless. It runs on intangible assets.
Like intellectual property, software patents, pharmaceutical formulas.
Exactly. Things that exist on a server or a legal document, not in a physical warehouse. And unlike a steel mill, a patent can be moved across the globe with the click of a mouse and a few legal filings.
I see where this is going.
What the World Bank data captured around 2015 was a massive wave of multinational corporations, primarily American tech and pharma giants, restructuring their global assets.
So they were moving things around on paper.
Yes. They essentially picked up their incredibly valuable intellectual property and legally domiciled it in their Irish subsidiaries to take advantage of the highly favorable tax environment.
Okay, let's trace this step by step so we really understand the accounting trick here. Let's say I run a massive global smartphone company.
Okay, tracking with you.
My engineers in California invent a brilliant new piece of software. I legally transfer the patent for that software to my corporate office in Dublin. What happens next?
What happens next is that every time a customer in Japan or Germany or Brazil pays to use that software, a portion of that revenue is funneled back to the entity that owns the patent.
Which is my Irish subsidiary.
Exactly. And because that revenue is technically flowing to an entity located within Ireland's borders, the international accounting rules dictate that it must be added to Ireland's GDP.
Wait, really? Even if the software was coded in California, manufactured on a phone in Asia, and sold in Europe?
Yes, that's the bizarre reality of global accounting. The value is recognized where the intellectual property legally resides.
Oh, wow.
So that 26% leap wasn't an explosion of local Irish productivity. It was the sudden onshoring of billions of dollars of corporate paperwork.
That is wild.
The GDP data became massively distorted because it included the transfer profits of these colossal multinational companies. It essentially turned the national scorecard into a funhouse mirror.
Which naturally leads to the ultimate cynical question.
I think I know what you're going to ask.
If this $100,000 GDP is a statistical illusion caused by global corporate tax optimization, is the entire economic miracle just a sham?
It's a fair question.
Think of it this way for you listening. Imagine a small, local, mom-and-pop shipping store. One day, they sign a contract to be the central processing hub for all of Amazon's returns for a massive region.
Okay, I like this analogy.
Suddenly, billions of dollars worth of inventory are flowing through their little shop. On paper, if you just look at the value of the goods passing through their doors, they look like a Fortune 500 company.
Right, their top-line revenue would be astronomical.
Exactly. But how much of that billion-dollar flow actually stays in their cash register at the end of the day?
Not much, just the processing fees.
Exactly. If the money just passes through a spreadsheet and leaves the country as corporate profit repatriation, are the actual citizens any richer?
It is the most vital question to ask when analyzing highly globalized economies. And if we move to slide 3, the data provides a very clear objective answer.
Slide 3 is the one that compares GDP to GNI.
Right. Yes. We have to look past GDP and look at gross national income, or GNI.
Because GNI strips away the illusion.
It does. GNI measures what the residents of the country actually get to keep.
Okay, how does that work in practice?
Well, if a foreign multinational generates $1 billion of profit in Ireland, but wires $900 million of it back to its shareholders in the United States, that $900 million is subtracted from Ireland's GNI.
Oh, that makes total sense.
Yeah.
It filters out the noise of repatriated corporate profits.
Exactly. And when you look at the macro data on this double-line chart, the visual divergence between these two metrics is staggering.
Yeah, let me describe this for the listener. For decades, the GDP and GNI lines moved together, locked in step.
They were basically identical.
But then, as the tech and pharma giants moved in, the lines split wide open, forming this massive shaded gray area. The slide actually calls it a sitter gap.
That gap is the visual representation of Leprechaun Economics.
It's huge. You have GDP rocketing up into the stratosphere and GNI tracking significantly lower.
And that gray shaded space between those two lines, that represents billions upon billions of dollars that technically exist on Irish balance sheets, but do not belong to the Irish economy.
It's phantom wealth.
It is phantom wealth, but And this is the crucial pivot point of the entire presentation. We cannot let the phantom wealth blind us to the very real wealth that was created.
Wait, really? Even after you subtract all the multinational smoke and mirrors?
Absolutely. Yes, the $100,000 GDP is distorted. But if you look exclusively at the GNI line, the hard retained wealth of the citizens, it still tells the story of an economic miracle.
I mean, how high does the GNI line actually go?
Well, the historical GNI per capita started around $60 in the earliest recorded periods. Today, it sits at over $70,000.
Wow, over $70,000.
Yes.
So to go back to our mom and pop store analogy, they might not actually be a Fortune 500 company, but the processing fees they are collecting from Amazon are so large that the owners went from struggling to pay rent to buying luxury cars.
Exactly. They expanded their business. The underlying wealth genuinely exploded.
That's incredible.
That's the reality. A retained national income of over $70,000 per person places the population among the wealthiest demographics in Europe.
So the statistical distortions are real, but they shouldn't obscure the fact that a massive generational increase in actual living standards occurred.
Precisely. The macro illusion is a distraction from the ground reality.
Okay, so if the $70,000 retained wealth is real, that demands an explanation.
It definitely does.
You don't jump from an agrarian peripheral economy to a $70,000 GNI by just doing things slightly better.
No, you have to fundamentally tear down the old system.
Right. You have to build a whole new engine of growth. So what are these people actually doing for work every day to generate that kind of retained wealth?
If we look at slide 4, we see that they completely reshaped their industrial structure. And they did it with a speed that is historically unprecedented.
Slide 4 is this fascinating stacked area chart. It tracks the proportion of total employment across 3 main buckets: agriculture, industry, and services.
And the most defining characteristic of this transformation is the absolute marginalization of agriculture.
Which is wild to think about from a cultural perspective. I mean, we were talking about a nation whose global identity, literature, and historical struggles were deeply, intrinsically tied to the land and to farming.
It was the bedrock of their society.
But the World Bank data shows that agricultural employment simply collapsed. There's a downward arrow on the chart specifically highlighting this.
Yes, labeling it agricultural marginalization.
The percentage of female employment in agriculture, for instance, dropped from its historical highs down to an astonishing 1%.
1%. It is the effective death of agrarian reliance.
That's just hard to fathom.
Well, when you transition an economy, you have to move your human capital to where the value is. And the value is no longer in the soil.
It was in the service sector.
Yeah.
And the service sector didn't just grow, it devoured the labor market. On the chart, the service area expands outward over the decades, like a trumpet shape, absorbing almost everything.
There's bold text there highlighting it as the dominant industry.
Right. It grew to employ nearly 90% of the female workforce and roughly 70% of the male workforce.
Well,
But, I have a real problem conceptualizing this.
what part?
When people hear service sector, they often think of retail, hospitality, pouring coffee, or ringing up groceries.
Ah, right, the local service economy.
Yeah. And you cannot build a world-beating, ultra-wealthy economy just by pouring lattes for each other and doing each other's dry cleaning. There's a ceiling to that kind of internal consumption.
You're touching on the critical distinction between non-tradable services and tradable services.
Okay, break that down for us.
Pouring a latte is a non-tradable service. It has to be consumed locally at the moment of production. You can't export a hot coffee to Tokyo.
Right, it would be cold by the time it got there.
Exactly. But coding a piece of enterprise software, managing global supply chain logistics, processing international financial transactions, or conducting pharmaceutical research, those are highly advanced tradable services.
Tradable, meaning they can cross borders.
Yes. The value is created in one location, but it can be sold and consumed anywhere on the planet.
So they didn't just build a service economy to serve their own domestic needs. They built a service economy to serve the globe.
Precisely. And this is where we have to look at slide 5, the export data, because it is the engine of the entire system.
This slide is a bar chart, and it has a horizontal baseline drawn right across the middle, representing 100% of GDP.
Right, so let's look at the early stages of this data cycle. Exports of goods and services accounted for roughly 30% of the nation's GDP.
That sounds pretty normal.
It is. That is a very normal, healthy ratio for a developing economy. It means you are mostly producing for your own people and trading a bit with your neighbors to get what you can't make yourself.
But then the strategy shifts drastically. The data shows the export bars crossing that 100% baseline
They punch right through it.
and then hitting 120% and eventually soaring past 140% of the domestic economic aggregate.
There are data labels explicitly highlighting those years with a note saying export scale surpasses domestic economy.
Let's just pause and break down how strange that actually is. It's like a town bakery that initially just bakes enough bread for the local village.
Okay, continuing the bakery analogy.
But suddenly, they figure out a way to freeze-dry their artisanal sourdough starter and ship it worldwide. Eventually, they're exporting 140% of what the entire town could possibly consume.
Their growth is entirely untethered from the local market size.
Exactly. It doesn't matter if the town only has 5,000 people, they are selling to a market of 5 billion.
That is the defining trait of what economists call a micro-open economy. The domestic market, the population is incredibly small, roughly 5 million people.
Which isn't a lot of consumers.
No. If your growth strategy relies on selling things to 5 million people, you will hit a wall very quickly. To achieve exponential wealth generation, you have to plug into the global matrix.
You have to become a node that processes value for the rest of the world.
Perfectly stated.
But building that kind of global export machine requires massive upfront capital. I mean, you need state-of-the-art server farms, advanced pharmaceutical manufacturing clean rooms, global fiber optic infrastructure.
Very expensive infrastructure.
Right. A traditionally poor agrarian society doesn't just have those billions of dollars sitting in a national piggy bank. How did they fund the construction of this engine?
Well, the short answer is they didn't fund it themselves. They imported the capital.
By turning the country into a magnet for foreign direct investment.
Yes. And slide 6 visualizes this beautifully.
This slide is wild. It's a positive-negative bar chart showing FDI net inflows and outflows, and it doesn't look like a normal economic trend line at all.
Not even close.
It looks violently volatile. It's a series of massive, towering spikes of capital flowing into the country, followed by deep, plunging valleys of outflows. Why is the capital moving with such extreme volatility?
Because the capital isn't a slow, steady trickle of thousands of small businesses opening up. It represents the lumpiness of global corporate behavior.
The lumpiness.
Yeah. When a multinational technology or pharmaceutical giant decides to restructure its intellectual property or build a new European operational headquarters, we are talking about multi-billion-dollar single transactions.
Just massive blocks of money moving at once.
Right. Those transactions are so massive relative to the size of the domestic economy that they create those towering spikes in the national data. The volatility is just a byproduct of scale.
Ah, I see. And the visual annotations on the chart actually circle those extreme peak years. There's a text box explaining that these reflect the tax and intellectual property restructuring activities of those tech and pharma giants.
Which is an important piece of context.
And we need to pause here for a second because this is often where the conversation around this economic model gets heavily politicized.
It does. It's a hot-button issue.
People argue constantly about whether corporate tax optimization is ethical or whether it starves other nations of their rightful tax revenue. Both left-wing and right-wing commentators have strong opinions on this.
They absolutely do.
But I want to make it very clear to you listening. Our mission today is to look at the data objectively. We aren't here to litigate the morality of global tax codes, and we aren't endorsing any specific political viewpoint.
We are just here to understand how a nation used those codes as a tool for survival.
Exactly. We're looking at the mechanics.
And from a purely structural standpoint, capital is highly rational. It constantly seeks out environments that maximize operational efficiency and minimize friction.
It goes where it's treated best.
Exactly. The architects of this transformation looked at their peripheral agrarian economy and realized they had to offer global capital something it couldn't resist.
So they deliberately engineered their tax policies, their corporate structures, and their regulatory environment to roll out the red carpet for foreign direct investment.
That was the strategy.
So if we synthesize these mechanics, it creates this massive macroeconomic feedback loop. Right. Well, you engineer highly favorable competitive policies. Those policies act as a gravitational pull, attracting these towering spikes of foreign direct investment from global tech and pharma giants.
Right. The capital flows in.
And that foreign capital builds the infrastructure. and brings the intellectual property, which immediately fires up an enormous export machine, sending tradable services out to the rest of the world.
Yes, the 140% export stat we saw.
But to keep those servers running and those labs researching, the multinationals need workers, which forces the domestic labor market to rapidly abandon the farms and upskill into the advanced service sector.
It is a brilliant, self-reinforcing cycle of hypergrowth. And once that flywheel starts spinning, it generates that $70,000 retained wealth we talked about earlier.
But here is where I get stuck.
Okay, what's the hang up?
That flywheel theory sounds perfect in a textbook, but it has a massive real-world flaw.
Which is?
If you are a massive technology conglomerate looking for a low-tax jurisdiction to park your capital and route your European sales, there are dozens of places you could go.
True.
You could set up a brass plate office in a Caribbean tax haven.
Yeah.
You could go to a microstate. Why did the capital actually land, build physical infrastructure, and hire hundreds of thousands of people in this specific country?
It's a great point.
Capital requires a low tax rate, sure, but it clearly needs something far more profound to actually take root.
You've hit on what I like to call the invisible architecture of the economy.
Invisible architecture.
Yes, a low tax rate is just the invitation to the party. It gets the executives in the door. But what keeps them there, what convinces them to transfer tens of billions of dollars in critical intellectual property, is an incredibly complex ecosystem of human capability and institutional trust.
Let's unpack the human capability first, because slide 8 has some staggering data on this.
The funnel infographic.
Yeah, it's a funnel showing the human capital reservoir, specifically the retention rates within the education system. It tracks what they call the persistence rate. How many students enter primary school and survive the funnel all the way through to higher education?
In many developing economies, that funnel is incredibly leaky.
Right.
You might have 90% primary enrollment, but by the time you reach upper secondary or university, you've lost 60 or 70% of the cohort to the labor market or sheer systemic failure.
But the World Bank data here shows a funnel with almost no leaks. The primary and lower secondary school completion rates sit at a near perfect 100%.
And they have stayed there for decades.
There are little annotations at the conversion nodes on the slide pointing out the excellent basic education retention. More importantly, the transition pipeline from high school into tertiary university-level education shows minimal attrition.
Which is the key to everything.
This system demonstrates an amazing capacity to retain and upskill its cohort.
And we really need to look at the timeline of this data because it reveals a profound truth about economic planning.
What's that?
You cannot simply pass a law creating a high-tech economy on a Tuesday and expect it to function on a Wednesday.
Right.
If a multinational software company decides to build its European headquarters in your capital city, they're going to need 5,000 software engineers, data compliance officers, and financial analysts immediately.
You can't just hand a farmer a laptop and say, good luck with the Python code.
Exactly. You can construct a state-of-the-art office building in 18 months. You can wire a server farm in a year. But it takes 20 solid years of relentless, high-quality investment to build a senior data scientist.
Oh, I see.
The educational data we are looking at proves that this nation was planting the seeds for a 21st century knowledge economy long before the tech boom ever arrived.
They were playing the long game.
They were patiently growing the brains required to run the engine. When the global capital finally came looking for a home, the workforce was uniquely primed and ready to absorb it.
So human capital is the first pillar of this invisible architecture. But you mentioned a second pillar, institutional trust. What does that actually mean in the context of macroeconomics?
It means the rules of the game are fair, transparent, and predictably enforced. Capital is inherently cowardly. It hates surprises.
And slide 9 tries to measure this lack of surprises. It's this massive radar chart, or a spiderweb chart, evaluating the nation across 6 global governance dimensions.
Political stability, government effectiveness, rule of law, regulatory quality, control of corruption, and voice and accountability.
And the performance across these metrics is just elite. The radar shape on the chart expands fully outward, outlined in this stark navy blue with no fill, just to highlight the objective shape of the data.
It covers almost the entire web.
Yeah, the data shows this nation consistently scoring in the top 90th percentile globally, specifically in areas like regulatory quality, control of corruption, and rule of law.
Put yourself in the shoes of a chief financial officer for a global pharmaceutical company. You are about to transfer the patent for a blockbuster cancer drug, an asset worth perhaps $50 billion over its lifetime, to a foreign subsidiary.
That's a huge decision.
It is. And you are not going to do that in a country where a corrupt local official can extort your operations. You are not going to do that in a country where the regulatory framework changes capriciously based on who won the last election.
You need absolute ironclad legal certainty.
You need a judicial system rooted in common law that respects and enforces commercial contracts predictably. You need a stable democracy where property rights are sacred. This is the ultimate institutional moat.
That concept of a moat is brilliant because a competitor nation can always choose to lower its corporate tax rate to try and steal the business.
That's just a stroke of a pen.
Right. But you cannot overnight replicate a century of legal stability, a near-zero corruption environment, and an education system that graduates world-class engineers with near 100% retention.
Exactly. The tax rate is the hook. The institutions and the brains are the moat.
And that is why the capital chose this specific node, and why it remains deeply entrenched there, despite global pressures to move.
It's a beautifully engineered system.
It is. But I have to play devil's advocate here, because history tells us a very dark story about hypergrowth.
I know where you're going with this.
If you look at the Industrial Revolution in the UK, or the massive economic booms in 20th century America, or the rapid industrialization in parts of Asia, that wealth came with a massive tangible cost.
The environmental cost.
Exactly. Usually, escaping poverty requires burning mountains of coal. The rivers turn toxic, the air becomes unbreathable, and you trigger severe public health crises. Did this nation have to pay the traditional dirty price for their economic miracle?
That is where Slide 10 presents a truly fascinating anomaly. It challenges the historical correlation between getting rich and destroying your local environment.
Let's look at this. It's a scatter plot mapping constant economic growth on the x-axis against carbon intensity on the y-axis.
Carbon intensity being measured as kilograms of carbon dioxide emitted per unit of GDP.
Historically, as GDP goes up, emissions go up. It's a tragic lockstep.
Usually, yes.
But here, we see a massive divergence. There's this distinct negative logarithmic fit curve drawn on the scatter plot. As the GDP went exponential, the carbon intensity plummeted off a cliff.
It's quite dramatic.
It dropped from over 0.56 kilograms of CO2 down to under 0.07. The text note explicitly labels this as a direct dividend of tech-intensive industries replacing high-energy ones.
Economists call this absolute decoupling.
Absolute decoupling.
Yes. It is essentially the holy grail of modern sustainable economics. Relative decoupling means your economy is growing faster than your emissions, but your emissions are still growing.
Okay.
Absolute decoupling means the economy is exploding in size, while the absolute volume of environmental damage being done is actually shrinking.
But wait, let's look under the hood of this miracle, because I am highly skeptical.
Fair enough.
Do they actually invent a magical green economy, or did they just offshore all the dirty work? I mean, if your entire economic model is based on bypassing heavy industry and leaping straight into high-tech tradable services, of course your air is clean.
Right.
It is incredibly easy to have a low carbon intensity when your primary export is cloud computing architecture and financial legal services. You're moving data packets, not smelting iron ore.
Very true.
So did they achieve absolute decoupling, or did they just outsource the pollution to factories in Asia that manufacture the laptops their software engineers use?
That is a highly astute pushback, and the data actually concedes your point. A significant portion of this decoupling is just the structural advantage of not having a heavy manufacturing base.
Right.
So yes, on a planetary scale, the carbon required to produce the physical goods this wealthy nation consumes is still being emitted somewhere. They exported the heavy lifting.
So the green miracle is just an accounting trick, just like the GDP.
Not entirely. It is a structural advantage, yes. But if we move to slide 11 and look at the energy grid data, we see that there is also a genuine domestic green awakening occurring underneath that structural advantage.
Because even a service economy requires massive amounts of power. Server farms and corporate headquarters consume vast quantities of electricity.
Exactly. They are incredibly power hungry.
And this smooth line chart tracking the source of electricity production shows a profound transition. we see two distinct trend lines moving toward what the visual calls a golden crossover point.
Yes, the crossover is key.
There's actually a little dotted line magnifying glass drawn on the chart, zooming in on this intersection. Historically, the domestic power grid was overwhelmingly reliant on imported fossil fuels, oil, gas, and coal. At its peak, fossil fuel dependence was over 94%.
Which is a massive vulnerability for an island nation. You are entirely at the mercy of global commodity markets.
But over the timeline of the economic boom, that reliance plunges, dropping significantly to under 50%. Meanwhile, the renewable energy line steadily surges upward to meet it.
Driven heavily by harnessing their geographic advantage, specifically wind power. The golden crossover is the moment renewables overtake fossil fuels.
So while they absolutely benefited from not having a massive steel industry, they are also actively and aggressively decarbonizing the domestic power they do use.
It is a real transition, not just an illusion of offshoring.
And when you combine a decarbonizing environment with exponential national wealth, you inevitably see a massive impact on the human body.
Ooh.
Which brings us to slide 13. The health dividends.
This is where macroeconomics becomes deeply personal.
Yeah. We have a step chart here showing long-term public health tracking, specifically focusing on neonatal and infant mortality.
Demographers and sociologists generally agree that infant mortality is one of the most sensitive, accurate proxy indicators for the overall competence and development of a society.
It isn't just a medical statistic.
No, it reflects the quality of the water supply, the baseline nutrition of the population, the education level of expecting mothers, and the capability of the medical infrastructure all simultaneously.
And the historical tracking here is a testament to the power of retained wealth. Historically, the mortality rate sat at over 30 deaths per 1,000 live births.
Which is tragically high.
But over the decades of this economic transformation, the steps on the chart collapsed downward, year by year, until it reaches the low single digits. There's a circle at the end of the chart labeling this as globally leading prenatal outcomes.
And furthermore, we see a complete epidemiological shift in the broader population. The cause of death shifts almost entirely away from communicable infectious diseases.
That is the ultimate so what of macroeconomic growth. When a country generates that $70,000 GNI, they stop dying of easily preventable infectious diseases.
Well, they build state-of-the-art water sanitation. They fund neonatal intensive care units.
The population lives long enough that the primary health challenges become the chronic, non-communicable diseases associated with old age.
Exactly. The wealth generated by routing global software patents and pharmaceutical exports directly translated into longer, healthier, more secure lives for the citizenry. It is a staggering human achievement.
It really is. It paints an incredibly optimistic picture of what is possible when a nation perfectly aligns itself with the currents of global capital.
It does.
But there's always but no economic model is flawless. Every system optimized for a specific outcome inherently creates vulnerabilities elsewhere. A chart only shows you what you ask it to measure.
That's the danger of only looking at the positive metrics.
Exactly. So for this next section, we need to actively look for the cracks in the facade. What is the shadow side of this hyper-globalized success story? Who gets left behind when your economy moves at the speed of light?
The first crack in the facade appears on slide 12, when we look at how that massive wealth is distributed across the labor market, specifically regarding gender.
Ah, right. When a rising tide lifts all boats, we still have to ask if everyone is allowed to sail in the same type of ship.
Beautifully put.
This slide features a dumbbell chart analyzing part-time employment broken down between men and women over time.
And it reveals a massive, persistent fault line.
It does. The horizontal line connecting the two docks on the dumbbell, which is explicitly labeled gender part-time difference, shows that despite the immense national wealth, despite the high education levels, female part-time employment reached highs of 57%.
Well, the part-time employment rate for men peaked at roughly 34%.
That is a vast structural gap.
It highlights a limitation of macroeconomic growth. The high-tech, tradable service economy might offer massive salaries, but it also creates highly demanding labor dynamics.
The macro wealth doesn't automatically rewrite micro-level societal inequalities.
No, it doesn't. While the data notes a slight narrowing of this gap in recent years, the sheer size of the disparity suggests that women are still disproportionately taking on part-time roles.
Likely due to structural societal factors like the unequal distribution of unpaid care work or a lack of accessible, affordable childcare infrastructure.
Exactly. You can build a 21st century economy, but if you still have 20th century social infrastructure, the labor market will reflect that friction.
That is a vital nuance. The engine is powerful, but it doesn't distribute the horsepower equally.
But there is another, perhaps more existential threat looming inside the data. On slide 7, the presentation outright calls it the demographic time bomb.
This slide is a dual-axis chart. There's an area chart tracking the working age population and a line chart tracking the old age dependency ratio over time.
This is the slow-moving crisis facing almost every advanced economy today, but it is particularly acute here given how heavily this model relies on a dynamic labor force.
For those unfamiliar, the dependency ratio measures the number of elderly people, those generally out of the workforce and requiring pension and healthcare support, relative to the working age population.
Historically, one of the massive competitive advantages this nation had when attracting global capital was its youth. They had an incredibly young, highly educated, and relatively inexpensive labor force ready to work.
But the data shows that advantage is rapidly eroding. The dependency ratio hit a low of around 15%, but that trend has reversed.
It's climbing steadily.
Yeah, there's a solid upward sloping arrow at the end of the line chart pushing past 24%. The text strictly warns of invisible pressure on pension and healthcare systems.
Let's play out the math on this so the listener can truly visualize the squeeze.
Okay, let's do the math.
When the dependency ratio was at 15%, you had roughly 6 or 7 active workers paying income tax to support every one retiree.
That is a highly sustainable, dynamic system. The tax burden on any individual worker is relatively low.
But as that ratio climbs past 24% and heads toward 30 or 40%, suddenly you only have 3 or 4 workers supporting that same retiree.
And those retirees are living longer, requiring more advanced, expensive medical care.
Exactly.
So if I'm a worker in this economy, my taxes have to go up to fund the healthcare and pensions of an aging population.
That's one option. Or the government has to slash the benefits provided to the elderly, which is politically toxic.
Right. But here is the unique trap for this specific economic model.
Yeah.
We established earlier that the entire miracle was catalyzed by maintaining an aggressively competitive, low-tax environment to attract foreign direct investment.
Oh, you see the collision course.
I do. If the domestic tax burden on the working population must increase dramatically to pay for elder care, does that trigger a brain drain? Do the highly educated tech workers leave for cheaper countries?
And if the government tries to solve the pension crisis by raising corporate taxes on the multinationals, do the tech giants pack up their intellectual property and leave?
Wow. The demographic time bomb directly threatens the delicate equilibrium of the invisible architecture we discussed earlier.
It is a squeeze from the inside. But slide 14 reveals a massive squeeze from the outside.
The potential macroeconomic hidden worries.
Yes, specifically looking at inflation volatility.
This slide is a bar chart with threshold bands. There's a light gray band indicating a normal, healthy inflation range of 0 to 3%.
Which is where you want to be.
Right. For long stretches, the CPI and GDP deflator stay within that band. But then there are these violent spikes where the bars shoot out of the gray zone and are highlighted in dark gray.
The text explicitly ties these spikes to imported inflation and global supply chain shocks.
This is the inevitable, unavoidable trade-off of the export machine, isn't it?
It is. Remember our bakery analogy.
Yeah, the one exporting 140% of its GDP.
When you are exporting that much and importing almost all of your physical goods and energy, your economy is completely, hopelessly tethered to the global market.
You sacrificed economic insularity for extreme growth.
Exactly.
You are a node on the network, which means you feel every single vibration on the web.
Precisely. If global shipping rates spike because of a conflict in a distant ocean, or if energy prices surge because of a geopolitical crisis on another continent, this hyper-open economy absorbs that shock directly, instantly, into its domestic prices.
When the global economy catches a cold, a perfectly open microeconomy risks catching pneumonia.
The volatility isn't a glitch. It is a permanent feature of the system they built.
Which brings us to the final slide, slide 15, and the synthesis of this entire deep dive.
The final analysis.
Yeah, this slide presents a logic diagram. It's not 3D, just a clean, flat design. 3 dark gray rings intersecting in the center.
And in the very center, the text reads, GDP breaks $100,000.
Right. It outlines a trinity transformation. 3 overlapping pillars that allowed this peripheral agrarian nation to completely escape the middle income trap.
It is a formula that developing nations around the world study obsessively.
Let's recap them.
Pillar 1. Extreme openness to global markets and foreign capital. You cannot grow rich selling only to yourselves.
Love to.
Pillar 2. Relentless long-term generational investment in human capital and education retention. You must have the brains to operate the capital.
The 20-year lead time for a data scientist.
Exactly. And Pillar 3. Ironclad institutional governance, regulatory quality, and the rule of law. You must provide a stable fortress for the capital to reside in.
When those three killers intersect, you get the miracle. But the slide doesn't end with a victory lap. There's a final warning text at the bottom.
It states that the ultimate challenge going forward is twofold. First, how do they cope with the dual pressures we just discussed? The internal pressure of an aging population and the external pressure of financing a complete energy transition.
Right, the internal and external squeezes.
But the second challenge is even more profound. They need to figure out how to transform the book wealth of these foreign multinational companies into domestic, endogenous innovation capacity.
Oh, that makes sense. That is the ultimate test of economic maturity.
It is. They have spent 40 years successfully acting as the ultimate host. They attracted the world's greatest innovation and managed it brilliantly.
But can they pivot from being the host to being the creator?
Exactly. Can the domestic workforce, who learned the ropes working for American tech and pharma giants, step out and build their own global conglomerates?
Can they generate intellectual property organically from within rather than just importing it for tax purposes?
That is the million-dollar, or I suppose billion-dollar question.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what does this highly specific, data-heavy case study mean for you, the listener?
It's a masterclass in strategic positioning.
It really is. Whether you are trying to understand the geopolitical forces shaping the modern world, or analyzing emerging markets, or even thinking about how to position your own career, it proves unequivocally that destiny is not fixed by your geography, your lack of natural resources, or your agrarian past.
It's about what you choose to build.
By deliberately optimizing for the future, by planting the seeds of education decades in advance, building unimpeachable institutional trust, and fearlessly plugging into the global network, a peripheral player can completely rewrite the rules of the game and become the center of the board.
It is one of the most remarkable strategic achievements in modern economic history.
I couldn't agree more.
But as we close, I want to leave you with a final, slightly unsettling puzzle to mull over.
Oh, I like a good puzzle.
We've just spent all this time exploring how a country perfectly, flawlessly optimized itself for a frictionless, hyper-globalized world. They built the ultimate node for a fully connected global network.
Right.
But look around at the geopolitical climate today. We are entering an era where supply chains are aggressively reshoring. Tariffs and protectionism are returning to mainstream political platforms.
The world is changing.
The very concept of globalization is fragmenting into defensive regional blocs. So the question is, what happens to the perfect global node when the global network itself starts to disconnect?
Oh, wow.
Can a model built entirely on extreme openness survive the end of the era that created it?
Now that is a question worth an entire deep dive of its own. Thank you for joining us as we stripped away the macro illusions to find the ground reality. Until next time, keep questioning the numbers, look for the mechanics beneath the headlines, and stay curious.